Forget trains, roads could be the way ahead, or at least that looks like it might be the thinking from the National Infrastructure Commission. Not helped by the news reports that Chancellor Rachel Reeves is said to be considering scaling back rail investment. And we start investigating plans for upgrading the West Coast Main Line. Welcome to Green Signals from me, Nigel Harris, and...
from me, Richard Bowker.
Well, we start this week with a story that a number of people got in touch with us about, and that's some of the quite extraordinary things that National Infrastructure Chairman Sir John Armitt said at a Transport Select Committee meeting on January the 15th. Most controversial of which was effectively that we should maybe consider giving up on trains because cars are getting greener. And that's how people want to travel anyway. We'll come on to that in a minute. The session was, according to the chair Ruth Cadbury, a one-off look at why major rail and road projects go over budget and what the country should be doing in terms of planning for a long-term infrastructure strategy. Richard, you're ever so good at diving into, I nearly said tedious government stuff, but I won't. You're very good at this detailed policy material. What did you think?
Diving in. This was quite the challenge, this one, I've got to say, Nigel. It was a bit frustrating. It was, it kind of felt a little bit ponderous and wasn't helped by the fact that there wasn't much of an audience there. But I got the sort of sense that everybody sort of felt as if they'd rather be somewhere else. You know, it had that sort of feel to it. Having said that, right, there were a couple of real standout moments that I think we all should be aware of, because influential people often say things in select committees that explain or give insight to what they're about to advise.
Yes, that's very true. It's a sort of little window on their thinking, isn't it?
Yeah.
But before we do that, why don't you just tell us what the NIC actually is?
Right. Well, the National Infrastructure Commission.
Easy for you to say.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I'll put my teeth back in. It's a relatively new thing. It's been going a few years. John, I think, has been the chairman since it started. It's an executive agency of the Treasury. It's designed to give impartial, sort of independent expert advice, if you like, on long-term infrastructure challenges. Every parliament, it produces a national infrastructure assessment, which is designed to explain where it thinks things are at, and it makes recommendations to the government. So that's what it is. It's a serious thing, but it's making recommendations.
Okay, so you picked out a couple of things which you wanted to focus on, which were interesting comments that suggest road schemes may be coming to the fore, and the consequences of bringing control of HS2 much closer to ministers. I have to say, neither fill me with much hope, so I hand back to you with some trepidation. What do you think?
Neither of them were particularly great things, really. Although I actually agree with John on one of them. We'll come back to that.
Okay.
We have been very selective. It's 2.5 hours long, as you said. So other people may form a different view as to what was the most important thing said, and we can't say everything. But these 2 points were quite big, I think, because John is an influential chap, and so even if the National Infrastructure Commission is only making recommendations, John is obviously quite close to what the thinking is, and so that's important. So let's focus on the first one. Very early on, Ruth Cadbury MP, who's the chair of the Transport Select Committee, asked, I felt, a slightly opaque question about whether there are infrastructure challenges outside of the devolved regions. Now, I should explain that. Immediately prior to the clip you're about to see or hear, they'd had a discussion. She and John Armitt had a discussion about what was really important. And he'd said, integration and devolution. So that's why they just talked about those two things. So in answer to Ruth Cadbury's question about infrastructure challenges outside of the devolved regions, this is the exchange that took place.
You make a number of recommendations about cities and city regions, but also your recommendations also cover major infrastructure projects, and we'll come on to HS2 and others. But as a generality, is there a challenge there that in terms of long-term investment?
Well, there's a number of, I suppose there are a number of strategic challenges, and in terms of also strategic thinking. The reality is that the vast majority of journeys in this country are made by road. And with continued decarbonisation of road transport, that of course removes one of the traditional arguments that you should use a lot more rail because rail is less polluting than road, but that will not be the case in the future. And as I say, the bulk of the population is totally reliant on road. The vast majority of journeys are made by car. I don't think people are going to leap out of their cars onto the trains, quite frankly, particularly if you're going on holiday with the family and you've got all the luggage. So I don't see any great significant growth in rail. There will be continued pressure on the roads, and therefore to ensure that we maintain a proper level of support and financial support for improving our road network. It's not a matter of building lots of new motorways, but we did a study which showed where all the key pinch points are across the country. There are a lot of them. They won't all be affordable, but the department needs to make some assessments on the economic benefits of each of those and decide which ones can be afforded in a reasonable period.
Hardly encouraging from the railway point of view, Richard, was it?
Well, no, because
is he right though?
Oh, the comment about roads. Well, I think it's more complicated. I think it's a bit more nuanced than what he said.
Okay.
Right? So what he said was,
always.
Yeah, he said the continuing decarbonisation of road transport, which is hard to argue against, right, means that he doesn't see much future growth in rail. He links the two, absolutely. I think he does that, but I don't think that's right. Okay.
No.
Now, why is it not right? Heavy rail has always been really good at a number of things. It's actually not a very long list.
No.
Okay. But they're very important things. So they've always been good at high frequency, high speed, by which I mean sort of 125 miles an hour, at least 125 miles an hour, limited stop intercity services. That's something that rail is terrifically good at. It's really good at high capacity, high frequency services on corridors such as into and out from major urban centres, right? Regional and commuting services, if you like. And it's brilliant at homogenous freight services, such as bulk movements or intermodal. Okay, so those are three things that it's really, really good at. And I have to say, I've always felt that everything else comes quite a way down the list, right? And that's not a new statement, right? So I think he ought to have said something along the lines of, in the areas where rail is really good, we should focus our efforts, and there should still be growth. Okay. But changing travel patterns, technology, the continuing decarbonisation of road means that the things that rail is less good at and has been increasingly less good at since the 1950s and the 1960s, that is going to sort of fall away even more. So that's I think what he should have said, but I fear it may have been heard slightly different, that road is king.
Well, especially by those who would seek to do rail down will take that as great encouragement, and it rolls the pitch for them. But those things you said, they're long-standing truths, aren't they? While you were speaking, I vividly remember Cecil Parkinson as Transport Secretary way back in the 1980s saying very similar things about long-haul freight and expresses. So those things, they've always been true and held good, haven't they?
Well, moment of controversy. what was really the fundamental underlying thesis of the Beeching report really was those things. I mean, a lot of people think that Richard Beeching just wanted to close everything. He actually really focused on the growth of homogenous intermodal freight and trunk routes and actually the idea of railheads and focusing on where rail was good. So quite a bit of this actually comes from that. But you're absolutely right. There's been a long-held understanding. And I think it does mean that, those who want to see loads and loads of stuff reopened, ask yourself, does it fit one of those three things? Because if it doesn't, chances are it's never going to happen.
Because containerisation and merry-go-rounds both were outcomes of Beeching, weren't they?
There you go. Point made.
So
that was the first big thing that he said that I think could have been misconstrued.
And will be by Rail's critics. So there we are. There's some cudgels which we have taken up and will continue to wield on Rail's behalf, as is our wont. Let's move on to the second point you highlighted, and that's the governance of HS2. You've been a critic, as have we all, of the decision to bring the control of HS2 even closer to government in the last 6 months, which Louise Haigh was very big on, ministerial oversight on a more intense basis. And it sounds as if Sir John Armitt agrees with you on this one. Here's what he said when asked a very specific question, which was not opaque at all, from Ruth Cadbury.
Okay, thank you. One last question for now on HS2. Is there a risk, by bringing projects such as HS2 in-house to the DfT, do you think that will mitigate some of the risks on that project?
Well, I have to confess I've never been convinced by the governance structure of HS2. Maybe I'm influenced too much by my own experience, but having been chair of the Olympic Delivery Authority, where we were a separate standalone body with our own ability to hire and fire, with our own ability to get on and be given significant delegated powers, I think the retention of HS2 Limited within the Department of Transport can lead to too much oversight, quite frankly. And transport is an intensely political area, and I can understand it being very difficult for ministers to stand back when they're the ones who at the end of the day have to stand up here and defend what's happening. And so the closer they can get to the detail, the better. But on the other hand, that is bound to lead to delays. It's bound to lead, I fear, to at times too much desire to actually meet every concern and objection and requirement for extra facilities within a scheme. And, as I say, I think there is a natural inevitability that when government, and by that I mean the whole machinery of government, is doing something, there is a desire to actually please people rather than a rather more private sector approach, which says, sorry, I have not got any more money. That is all we can afford. And I think government is not very good at saying that.
So is that a score draw, Richard, where or a 1-0, however you want to put it, but one you think Armitt's got it right and one where he hasn't?
Yeah, I think on this he's absolutely spot on. It's interesting. This whole, I think it shines a light on the general thinking inside government, right? I think that, and this is my opinion, it's just my opinion. Everybody will, that's the joy of a podcast, isn't it? These are our opinions. I think that any bringing of HS2 closer and closer to ministerial and civil service oversight and control is doomed to fail.
God help us all.
I think it's doomed to fail. Why? Because of the reasons that John says. Politicians and their officials, but politicians make political decisions fundamentally, right? They don't make commercial ones. I'm not saying they don't make ones that are political and commercial, but they are driven by political requirements. And he talked, John, there about, their desire to keep people happy. Remember, and this might sound a bit cynical, but a mainstream political party's primary job is to stay in power and get re-elected. So they're going to do things that they think will keep people happy, whether they're the right things or the wrong things, depending on your point of view.
And in the short term rather than the long term, with an election never more than 5 years away.
Exactly. So when you do things like that and you bring things closer, you create a real risk. And the more you bring things closer and the more you think you need to control them, the worse they become. So you do even more process and bureaucracy until in the end, you suffocate to death the thing that you were trying to control. That's why I just think this is dead wrong. And that's exactly what John said. And in fact, he said another wonderful thing, possibly the best thing I think he said of all. Listen to this.
There's a lot to be learnt. We've been trying to learn it for the last 50 years, and I think one of our concerns is that we seem to continue to make the same mistakes. I was talking about this last night elsewhere. We know what is the best way to manage and develop large projects, but unfortunately we don't always do it.
So there you go, Nigel. That's vintage Armitt, right? That's vintage Armitt. He's basically saying, we know what to do. We're not very good at doing it. We don't do it, which is a sort of slightly depressing, really, isn't it? But bringing mega projects or really anything under direct ministerial oversight, control, whatever, I think that's fairly high up on the list of things you don't do if you want to get things done on time and on budget.
And it's worse than what you said. You're right about politicians making political decisions. The thing with officials making decisions, although they'd never admit it, is they're making career decisions as well. They're not going to want to do anything that's going to come back and bite them or stop the next promotion or ruin the career or anything else. And you've got that overlaid on top of all the political stuff, which is why I think it is so poisonous when the DfT gets control to the degree it has. You've those agendas going, and look what happens on the railway. Nothing, there's no sort of. That's why you need a buffer, be it the SRA or Great British Railways or whatever, which, as we've said many times, broken records time. What sort of railway do you want, government? Then leave us to it, turn away, and we will deliver it once you tell us how much money we've got. And then there's a political firebreak between the government and the railway. So if it all went wrong, they could fire you when you're at the SRA rather than the officials, isn't it?
It really does come down to appetite for and, I suppose, competence for the management of risk, right? That is really the issue. Politicians and civil servants make decisions where they try and avoid all risks.
Which you can't do.
People with project and delivery experience know that you have to manage risk. It is an inevitable reality of life. Those two different perspectives, I'm not saying either's wrong or right, by the way, but when you are in the project or the operational delivery business, you have to make decisions and you have to know how to manage risk and you have to inject pace. And that is the problem. Which
takes us neatly on to maybe some people will regard the uniquely depressing news that the government's announced it's going to create a new body called NISTA, the National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority. In a speech back in October 2024, Darren Jones MP, Chief Secretary of the Treasury, confirmed the move to boost oversight and delivery of the government's infrastructure plans. NISTA will combine the functions of the National Infrastructure Commission, NIC, and the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, IPA. According to Mr. Jones, NISTA will have, quote, a strong mandate and be subject to direct oversight from ministers, groan, at the centre of government. So that's okay then, eh? I suppose.
Well, we'll see. We'll see.
Can you edit in a little tumbleweed moment there with a howling wind? And
we'll do our best.
Anyway, I suppose that takes us nicely onto a story that appeared in The Times on Saturday, January 18th, in which it was reported that Chancellor Rachel Reeves, trying not to say Rachel from accounts, perhaps surprisingly for some, she remains in post as Chancellor, is considering limiting rail spending to maintenance only, leaving just the three big enhancement projects of HS2, East West Rail, and Transpennine route upgrade. According to The Times, beyond that, spending on a major revamp of Britain's Victorian rail infrastructure, there it is again, will be limited to safety-critical maintenance unless the DfT can convince Treasury to bring in private investment, sources added. The article talked about selling off the stations on East West Rail and private investors charging the state for the usage of the stations on perhaps shadow toll basis. It's the same government that wants everything back in-house, Richard.
It's very interesting, isn't it?
Have I fallen through a gap in the reality continuum?
Well, I couldn't possibly comment on that, but on this, why one of my big bugbears, right? And I realise that I probably should just let this one go. Why do they keep writing Victorian rail infrastructure, right? We know that some of the bridges and the viaducts and the tunnels are right. Yes, clearly, but there's quite a lot of investment been done in the last 100-odd years. So I just find that a bit frustrating.
It's just knee-jerk muscle memory from journalists who aren't paying attention, frankly.
Is that just a long way of saying lazy?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And anyway, spending cannot be restricted to just safety critical.
Of course
right?
it can't.
CP7, Control Period 7, has already been awarded. So that covers operations, maintenance and renewal expenditure.
For
so
5
Network
years.
Rail, for 5 years, right. So this idea that you're not going to change that, right, that would just be...
Well, you can't reopen a regulatory settlement, can you?
No. But additional spending, which is on top of
Yes.
that. And Rachel Reeves effectively controls that by the mechanism of the spending review. So if you want sort of more capital enhancement, yes, that I do accept. And that's where the axe could fall. Now, let's be clear, HS2 is already a shadow of its former self. East West Rail is not being electrified throughout anyway. And the rumours around the timescales to go into Cambridge, I suspect I won't be around to see it. And Transpen and route upgrade, I think, is being sort of talked about having value engineering, which I always read as
cheap
cuts. And as for using things like public-private partnerships, or whatever you want to call it, for stations on EWR, well, yeah, ideological purity is a wonderful thing, Nigel, until you run out of cash. So, the whole thing does not feel very rosy.
It's not shaping up to be a great year, but the government did say that they would build. Did they forget to add just not rail to their sloganeering? They will, of course, say they committed to invest in record amounts in rail. See, aforementioned projects. But politics is a fluid business, isn't it? Excuse me. And the numbers on the economy are just not stacking up right now, are they? All the indicators, all the trajectories are the wrong way for her, whether it's debt or costs of debt or growth in the economy or whatever.
Yeah, and look, we're not commentators on the wider political scene, but let's be straightforward about it. Capital is going to be needed for defence. The world is not getting a more straightforward place. It's going to be needed for other areas where traditionally they are higher up in the food chain than transport. So I agree with you. And I think there's another problem here, and I don't want to sound too miserable, but I think there are two separate realities almost forming now, where you've got the people that are thinking about the spending review and clearly, rolling the wicket with stuff like this just to manage expectations.
There's some coat trailing going on in there.
Indeed. So there's that world where it is going to be all about living within a much more constrained fiscal settlement than perhaps we would all like. And then you've got the other parallel universe of people, happily talking about this project and that project and reopen this and reopen that and do all these things. And I'm not being disrespectful of them, but I'm not actually quite sure what world they really are living with, because I think the first one, the fiscally constrained one, that is the reality. And it's an increasing reality, if that's not a mixed metaphor, but that's the problem. So all very well to have these dreams of other stuff, but for the next 5 years, I don't think they're happening.
What was it, Richard, that your hero, Sir Peter Parker, said about the crumbling edge of quality? Are we heading back there?
Well, yeah, we could be, because, if we've got to live within constrained means and the industry doesn't get a grip on costs, or it's not able to get a grip on cost because of all this wonderful micromanagement from the centre. I don't know. Yeah, that could be a concern. Yeah.
It's not a terribly encouraging picture for 2025 and Rail 200 that's emerging, is it? But let's move on to something else that's really worrying. The Times, and they've been busy little bees this week, reported on January 14th that they'd seen some of the planning documents for the forthcoming West Coast Main Line upgrade north of Warrington to Gretna. And it could mean, and I quote, millions of passengers facing a decade of severe disruption. Is this deja vu all over again, Richard?
It is. I was going to say, the hairs on the back of my neck are sort of rising a little bit. Yeah, keep going with the West Coast route modernisation.
Okay. They do at least add, the work is essential to keep passenger and freight trains moving between Scotland and England. So let's just have a quick summary, shall we? Let's catch ourselves up with where we've been over the last couple of decades. The West Coast Main Line north of Preston was electrified and upgraded in the early 1970s. 1974, I remember the posters, the electric Scots are coming. And the kit is approaching life expiry. They took my beloved Class 50s away, I remember. So a project called Trilink was established to not only renew all the OLE, the overhead, but also replace signalling with ETCS, digital signalling, and sort out the comms, but also do some track work with extended loops with faster entry and exit therefrom. A once-in-a-generation chance to do some joined-up thinking. Now, wouldn't that be radical? We all know that blockades can be a very efficient way of organising such work because you keep mobilisation and demobilisation events to a minimum, as well as many other economies of scale and efficiencies. Deep breath, broken record time. Surely, though, Richard, surely...
I know what's coming.
Not once for yes, twice for no. In a period when politicians are calling for a... What was it Heidi Alexander said this week? Oh, yes, a relentless focus on the passenger. Yawn. It is time for the settling Carlisle to do its bit again as a diversionary route.
Yeah, here we go, right. Bingo. Ball in the back of the net. Yeah.
As it did... He slots it in. Yeah. As it did every week just about when you and I were young lads, when the Preston-Carlisle line was being wired and there was divergence all the time over the S&C. Surely, if we can't do that, it is the system that's wrong, not the idea.
But when you and I were lads, we had black and white tellies, Nigel.
It wasn't that long ago.
Well, I don't know. Right. I don't know. Look, a slightly different world. I think that's part of the problem here. And anyway,
not for passengers, it's not. They don't like getting off on buses. That's not a different
Well,
world.
hang on a minute. You just given Heidi a hard time for having a relentless focus on the passenger. Make your mind
for
up.
Not having, for saying it, but not doing it. If it was relentless focus on the passenger, she'd be saying, keep them on trains and send them over the long drag. Full stop, end of, move on.
Right, okay. Well, possibly an alternative take on that. I mean, look, it's a different railway now, okay? Back when we were talking about the last time, I remember major diversions and drags over the South Carlisle line.
Drags.
But it was locomotives and coaches, and we kind of had the assets, and there was I suspect, today, cost or net subsidy is very different, and there's much more of a focus on it than there was. It's not that straight. The assets aren't just sort of sat around. I suppose that's my point. And the other factor is, I guess, I'll say something really controversial now. In terms of a diversionary route from Glasgow to London, well, we've got one. It's the East Coast Main Line, right?
Not if you live in the northwest, it's not.
Right. So the area where is affected here, we're really talking about places like Preston, Lancaster, Oxenholme, Penrith, and then Carlisle, right? Those. So you could potentially, and I would like to understand this, why could you not, for instance, run effectively a Preston-Carlisle shuttle to cover those routes, okay? But I don't know. I think the whole question of diversions it's a nice it feels nice, it feels logical, but I just wonder whether the cost of doing that and the operational disruption of doing that outweighs the benefits that are actually delivered for the people that are really affected. And that is, I know that's not a popular view. It's not a popular view on social media, right? With people saying, no, you should divert. But I'm wondering whether it's a little more complicated.
So let's get
drilled
into it, because LNER manage it on a grand scale. They divert hither and thither and everywhere at the drop of a hat. It just seems if you stack all this stuff up, Richard, we keep talking about relentless focus on the passenger. We talk about the railways playing a huge part in the social and economic and all the rest of it. But at the first sign of problem, we throw people off on buses, which says the railway isn't important. You can't have it both ways. I'd like to see some sort of document, survey or review of exactly what you've just said.
Yeah.
All options between Preston and Carlisle. I mean, I can't believe I'm about to say this, but I am. I mean, but what about contracting West Coast Railways to run a shuttle from Preston to Carlisle using their own equipment? Has it even been looked into? Avanti have got bi-modes that trains that could do it, but you know they're choosing.
Yeah, but they're being used elsewhere.
They're choosing to use them elsewhere.
Yeah, because hang on a minute, you've got to use them on the North Wales coast, because how the heck are you going to run services on the North Wales coast?
But it's such a bad look to say it can't be done and it's too much trouble, and that's the problem. We just keep saying, "Oh, it's just too much trouble."
Wait a minute, you've just said that they've said it can't be done. I'm not sure anybody said anything about it at all, right? So that's why I agree we need to have a little bit of an investigation into this. I think it's one thing to run round the Hertford Loop on a diversion, or to take a bi-mode across from Newcastle to Carlisle if you're LNER.
Yeah.
We're talking here about a major blockade, a series of blockades on on the West Coast main line, and the diversionary strategy from going around the Settle Carlisle is not trivial, right? But however, I agree, we're going to look into it. Blimey.
Who has it said the other week that there's a puddle in Lockerbie, so we're shutting north of Preston? Oh, that would have been you.
I was talking about on a day-to-day operational scenario. I was not talking about a blockade strategy when you're actually doing a major upgrade.
This all stacks up to mindset.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed Nigel and Richard sort of going hammer on tongs on something they don't entirely agree on. But I'm sure when we've got all the facts, because I know how hot we all are on evidence-based analysis, we'll be able to form an opinion.
So we'll come back. We'll come back to that. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you a bit of a giggle here, because in my running order, which is just scrolling past me on screen, it says RB and NH to discuss briefly.
Yeah, anyway, we've still got a load more to get through.
So let's get on.
Going.
So one of the casualties of the Labour government's approach to the railway is Rail Partners, the trade body set up to promote and focus on the interests of the private sector operates both passenger and freight on the railway. Now, Rail Partners announced recently that from March 2025, so not that long away, they will wind up their operations. They have been, though, quite fierce critics of the approach being adopted, that instead of combining the best of both worlds, public and private, it seems rather ideologically wedded these days to one approach, a state-owned railway by and large. So, Richard went along to speak to Rail Partners Chief Exec Andy Bagnall, who's always a good talker, always has been, and it's fair to say that whilst he was measured and courteous, he did not hold back either. Now, we'll release the full interview with Andy next week in our regular Tuesday slot, and it is a belter. As I said, Andy's a great talker. But for now, here's a teaser.
It was odd, wasn't it, in the Passenger Railway Services Public Ownership Bill, now Act, that instead of leaving the opportunity for there to be private sector operators, it specifically prohibits it, which felt to me very ideologically motivated. Why would you remove optionality?
We certainly thought it was a mistake to remove the part of the system with a track record of growth before you could clearly show on a sort of evidence-based way how you were going to replace that element of the system that you were removing. I mean, you've just said it, that all the First Act did, it was a very short piece of legislation, 3-4 clauses. It simply made it illegal to contract the private sector again after the contracts that are currently there expired. It left all of the hard questions. How are we going to attract more passengers? How are we going to improve the financial position for taxpayers? How are we going to design the system to deliver those outcomes? Also, how it would work for what was also in the Labour document, freight operators and open access operators are still in the private sector. All of the detail has been left for the second bill this year. So I certainly think it's bold to remove the bit of the system that, not perfect, but has a track record of delivering growth before you know what's going to replace it.
Government makes its own job harder, shocker.
Quite. Okay. Right. Now, moving on to something that a couple of people mentioned on social and even dropped us a couple of emails about, which we didn't cover last week, but certainly was newsworthy. And that is that the General Secretary of the RMT union has announced that he is stepping down. Mick Lynch, of course. He's been in the role since 2021. I mean, he's 60, he's early 60s now, 63, I think. He served 2 terms as Assistant General Secretary, and obviously being General Secretary, so that's quite a long period of time. I thought what he said in his when it was announced he was leaving, he said a couple of really interesting things. He said it's been a privilege to serve this union for over 30 years. Now it's time for change. It's been through a lot of struggles in recent years. I believe it's only been made stronger by that. But then he said towards the end of his state, he said, RMT will always need a new generation of workers to take up the fight for its members and for a fairer society for all. And I am immensely proud to have been part of that struggle. One of the things about Mick, whatever your views on unions, whatever your views are on the way they have approached the recent industrial issues, Mick Lynch is a very effective, articulate communicator. Whatever your view is. And, I've seen plenty of journalists get in a right old pickle, even select committees get in a right old pickle trying to catch him out. He's, he is pretty impressive when he's arguing his corner, whether you agree with that corner or not. So, well done on your service, Mick, and it'll be interesting to see what comes next.
Time of great change on the union front across the board, because Mika Aslef Whelan is on his way, I think, in a year or so, isn't he? I think he's retiring as well. So it's all changed there. Yep. But you're right, Mick Lynch, and I'm a huge admirer, even when I disagree with people, on sincerity and authenticity and consistency. And Mick Lynch has always ticked all those boxes with great enthusiasm. But there again, RMT's got a bit of a history of it. Bob Crow was soon I talked about John Armitt earlier. And I remember John telling me when he was chief executive of Network Rail, he said how well he got on with Bob Crow. And I sort of sat back a bit. He said, no, he said, don't run away with the idea that with the Bob Crow that you see on the picket lines on TV news is the same Bob Crow that walks through that door and sits down and negotiates with me.
I would agree with that. I got on very well with him.
And he said, we had a wonderful relationship. And I've often thought about that, that very elegant patrician John and the son of toil Bob Crow. But John spoke incredibly highly of Bob, and so it's always important to see beyond the public face of people, which I always used to tell people about you, Rich. I said, don't think about it.
I knew exactly where that was about to go, because everybody says you were such a good. She said, "No, you're okay." Is that what you were going to say?
Yeah. When we were looking, I was doing some research on the RAIB interview, and I was looking through the 2003 Binder Rail magazine comments, and there's a few where I've mentioned you in comments, and one that made me smile was that Richard Bowker did not take this job to win a popularity contest, and I put in brackets result there, Richard. Close brackets.
Do you know, you've got to work out with all these jobs, and this will be an issue for the new chief executive of GBR, right? Being serious for a second. You've got a choice when you take these roles. Yeah. Do you want to make a difference, or do you just want to keep everybody happy?
Absolutely.
They are pretty much, you can't have them both.
And
That's always been my view, right?
And if you're into making differences, you're into eggs and omelettes territory, aren't you?
Yeah, it doesn't mean you have to be an idiot or reckless or just go out of your way to be rude, but you cannot keep everybody happy and make a big difference.
No, indeed not. Right, and now it's time to thank everyone who's left us a super thanks on YouTube again this week. Chris Exley, Alan Kirkman, Bob Walsh, Derek Bond, Michael Seagrave, Andrew Seddon, Paul Roberts, Nigel Mapston and Mariam Bloom. Thanks ever so much to each and every one of you. We really do appreciate that so many of you do leave us those super thanks, so thank you ever so much indeed.
Indeed, we do. We do appreciate it. And we also thank all our members. Thanks to our new gold and silver members who are Robert Ash, David Martin, Ed Raw, and John F.K. You can see all our members in the end credits. We list everybody, gold, silver, and bronze. If you're a gold or silver member, do let us have your address. Send it to info@greensignals.org because you've got stuff we need to send, like a mug. But thank you for your membership. We really do appreciate it. I know, right. For those of you who are listening to the podcast rather than watching it, you will not have seen that Nigel's just held up his Green Signals mug, which I've had to replace because he broke the first one.
I keep forgetting, for those of you watching in black and white, the pink's between the blue and the green.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, shall we do the railway news roundup?
I think we should.
Yeah, let's do that. Starting with bridge strikes again this week, but a good one. A bridge which is struck frequently, causing delays on the East Coast Main Line, is to have tech installed to reduce delays and costs when strikes occur. The Harloxton Road Bridge in Grantham, that's the one just at the north of the station, at the bottom of the ramp, besides which, incredibly, 6 roads converge, was in the most struck bridges category last year, despite having very high profile height signs, chevrons, protect God knows what. But it's still been struck by vehicles 11 times in the last 9 months, including 3 times in a week last November, costing the taxpayer more than £600,000 in damage and delays. This new remote monitoring equipment will mean engineers can check the structure in seconds rather than hours after a strike. A series of cameras and sensors will provide real-time remote alerts and access to data and video footage. If the trial proves successful, the same system will be installed at other suitable bridges. Exasperation.
Yeah, I know. Well, look, let's hope that it does work because we've got to find something that does reduce the numbers. Right, this story was sent to us by Dominic Ryan. So thanks, Dominic. Shortly after the election in July, one of the things that the government did do, of course, was scrap the planned tunnel for the A303, which currently goes past Stonehenge and was going to go under, right? But it's not, stating that the £2 billion price tag was poor value for money, and they also scrapped a few other road improvements. So an organisation called the Transport Action Network asked Green Gauge 21, which was the team set up by Jim Steer a few years ago, to look for a better alternative to the scrap scheme. And they've done that. And they have produced a report which includes the fact that the Salisbury to Exeter line, which is obviously part of the Waterloo, Basingstoke, Salisbury, Exeter Railway, is sorely in need of investment. The railway line does parallel the A303 for a huge amount of its time. And they said, actually, it's a railway that fails the most basic tests of meeting passenger needs and service reliability and the ability to get a seat. Pretty strong stuff. And they've also there's a load of other stuff in the report about bus rail connections. They've talked about parkway stations at Wellington and Devizes, which of course had me ears pricked up. So we'll look at this a bit more because it's all linked, if people recall, to the discontinuous electrification stuff that South Western Railway and Network Rail are looking at. So we'll come back to that because it does have real potential, that. But for now, it's sorely in need of investment, apparently.
Speaking of investment, Northern has invited train manufacturers to begin negotiations to supply 450, 450 new trains for the north of England. The plan is to introduce new trains on a phased basis, replacing the oldest units in Northern's existing fleet. So that's the 150s, 155s and 156s first, with approximately 2/3 of the fleet planned to be replaced in the next decade. Big numbers. Northern is looking for a mix of electric and multimodal trains and looking for battery options as well, and has asked that multimodal options should be capable of conversion to battery or electric only in their lifetime, which sounds to me like good sense.
It does. Can you believe those 150s, those sprinters?
I know.
They're like 40 years old, aren't they? It's like 85,
I remember them
86.
coming along as second generation BRDMUs.
I know. Amazing. They don't owe anybody anything, that's for sure. Right, the Rail Accident Investigation Branch, who Nigel, you spoke to, their Deputy Chief Inspector, recently. They've released their report into a fatal accident that took place at Stratford Underground Station.
Horrific.
This is awful. On Boxing Day 2023. I'll just read this because I don't want to get this wrong. Passenger alighted from a Jubilee Line train at the station at 13:57, sat on a platform bench opposite where they left the train. At 14:45, they stood up, but immediately stumbled forwards and fell from the platform onto the adjacent track. They were unable to get to a position of safety. They lay on the track undiscovered for around 5 minutes and then were struck by an arriving train. The presence of the passenger on the track remained unknown, and a further 3 trains entered the platform. Unfortunately, the passenger was fatally injured. Now, there were no staff or other passengers on the platform. The operators of the first and second inbound trains didn't see the passenger. Now, remember, the Jubilee Line uses ATO, automatic train operation. RAIB said that the third saw something and didn't recognise it as a person.
Oh, God.
A customer service assistant was by now on the platform, was now aware of the passenger, but did not stop the 4th train. And that 4th operator saw the passenger, but did not stop the train. So RAIB has made 2 recommendations coming out of this. The first is to consider technology that can detect if a passenger is in a dangerous position and intervene or warn an approaching or departing train if they are. And the second is to review factors in automatic train operation that lead to the repetitive nature of the tasks, creating an underload, that's their word, on the operators of the trains. Isn't it? It's a really interesting point about the effect of automatic train operation on our ability to remain alert. So that story is really awful. It will have affected people, but important recommendations coming out of it nonetheless.
Not new though, Richard. I mean, going back to Midland Railway days, the Midland Railway did not like the idea of just the old-fashioned lever collar in signal boxes at first because of the similar effect they thought it would have on the signalmen not paying attention. And some of the mainline railways didn't like the Great Western's ATC equipment for the same reason, making jobs easy for driver and undermining their alertness. So that principle has been around for a long time, but that is a horrible, horrible, horrible story. Your heart goes out to everybody involved, the railway men and women just terrible. Altogether more mundane, but still important, contactless ticketing is being rolled out at 47 more stations in the southeast, meaning that from February 2nd, dozens of key commuter lines will offer tap-in, tap-out journeys, guaranteeing the best value ticket available on the day. Hooray. Another 49 stations will follow throughout the year, including London to Stansted Airport, which means that all London airports will be tap-in, tap-out later this year, which is a worthy milestone, isn't it? A great move forward in simplifying ticketing on some journeys at least.
Absolutely. Thanks to David Redgewell for sending us this one. First Rail has published a report setting out its view of the future for open access operations in the UK. Now, we don't have time to go into this in any detail today, but we will do because fairly soon, because it sets out their view of the economic case for how open access can attract people out of cars and planes onto trains. And effectively, what they're saying is open access creates the environment where everybody, including the state operator, ends up with more people and therefore more revenue than they had before the open access operator was there. Now, that's an interesting thesis, and it's one that is worthy of discussion. So we will do that. And it sets out recommendations about what the government should do. Very important in the light of Heidi Alexander's recent letter to the ORR. So we'll be going into this one.
It was a point of view put forward very strongly by First, wasn't it, in the interview you did with Martin?
With Martin Gilbert at Luma
Gilbert.
and with Steve Montgomery,
Yeah.
who's obviously managing director of First.
But as you
First
say,
Rail.
interesting timing after Heidi Alexander's letter to the ORR, basically pulling the plug on open access.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Oh, well, hang on. Let's be a bit fair. I mean,
sorry, I was simplifying and exaggerating.
Well, I was going to say, I don't think she went that far. I mean, she basically said, I understand that you've got to do what you've got to do, ORR, but I want you to have more focus on my budget. And she explained why. But I think she did indicate what might be coming in the rail bill. So that's why I think everybody is on high alert. And as you say, interesting timing.
Yeah. And that's the news roundup for this week. If you'd like to send in any bits and pieces of news or big stories, please do send them to us. Don't assume we've already heard stuff, because we haven't. It can be local to you. It can be national. Please just send it to us. And if we use your email or your tip, we will, of course, give you a name check on the show. So I'm going to settle down for a snigger, because it's that time.
It is that time. It's time to do the quiz.
Yay!
Yay! Right. Now we had, I think, a fairly easy question last week.
It was, because I knew the answer.
Oh no, I don't think it was that easy.
It was.
Okay. So it was a fairly easy question, and that was certainly evidenced by the number of people that sent in answers, which was a lot, right? The question was, what's the railway connection between Dick Turpin, Prince of Wales, and Doncaster? Now, it's interesting, actually. Some people came up with slightly convoluted answers. The correct answer is that they were all names that adorned Gresley A3 Pacifics.
Sisters of Flying Scotsmen.
Indeed so. So 60... how do you do steam notes? So 60080,
6080, 60054.
54 and 48. Okay.
Yeah.
If you said A1 stroke A3s, that was also correct, because of course they were originally A1s and they were converted, those particular three. Somebody said, I think, the connection is they were built in Doncaster, and that's why Doncaster. I don't think that's right. I think one of them might have been a North British build. But anyway, there we go. But either way, the answer was A1 or A3, whichever you preferred, or both. And they were all A1, A3 Pacifics. And the winner, randomly chosen from the many correct answers, was Bill Roberts. So well done, Bill. If you send us an email again to quiz@greensignals.org, we can get your mug to you. Right. In the spirit of giving everybody a chance to win a mug, here's this week's. And it's, I think, also it's a great question. This: who is the world's first recorded train spotter? There you go. If you think you know, send us an answer to quiz@greensignals.org by midday on Saturday, January the 25th. We'll put all the correct answers in a hat and pick one at random. And that's the quiz.
The A3 names were slightly curious, weren't they? Because they were all racehorses. I think they were all Derby winners. Whereas the LMS had sort of colonies and battleships and admirals and, stuff like that. I often used to think, did anybody wander down the platform end at King's Cross before their train? And we're thinking, what on earth's going on here, where they found an engine that would call Spearmint Brown Jack or Gay Crusader or whatever, thinking, what the heck is going on here?
I think the one that was called Prince of Wales had originally been called something else. I think it had been a racehorse, but it was renamed Prince of Wales in honour of the Prince of Wales, I believe. So there you go. You learn loads of stuff, because some people give us very detailed answers, but there you go.
They do. Just a depth of knowledge, isn't it? Okay, this is a rather fun little story to end on. A Southern engineer based at Stew Lane Depot, at Stewart's Lane in Battersea, has had his own digital art sent to the moon in a rocket. Yes, you heard that correctly. Edward Fee is an engineer by day and a celebrated digital artist by night. On January the 15th, his artwork, stored on a memory stick along with other artists' works, was blasted off to the moon in a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket. The capsule inside also held different items representing human life and technology. Ed was lucky enough to witness the launch from Cape Canaveral in Florida. I wonder what other surprising talents railway men and women have. But that's a heck of an experience, isn't it? To watch your own art blasted off to the moon.
That's very cool.
From
Well done, Ed.
Cape Canaveral. I think that's absolutely brilliant. And sadly, that's all we've got time for this week. Thanks so much for watching or listening. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up or subscribe if you're on YouTube. And if you really want to support us, find out about membership on YouTube or Patreon, where you get all sorts of cool stuff. But please remember, this show will always be free. Most importantly, join us again next week, where I can put Richard on the spot again about diversions or whatever that's going on. I shall enjoy that. Always do. So it's goodbye from me, and
it's goodbye from me.
See you next week.